Next, we're picking up with chapter 8.2 on the business cycle, and now we're going to be talking about a model of the macroeconomy. So let's go back and remind ourselves about some important terms we need to keep associated with the business cycle so we have the right nomenclature in our head. When we talk about economic growth, we're talking about real GDP, and remember, the word real means adjusted for inflation. So it's not just the prices going up, but the actual production of goods and services is rising and is growing at faster than 3%. Why 3%? Because that's the long run average. So we're calling economic growth GDP growth faster than 3%. So that's the business cycle expansion phase. A growth recession, a term we picked up with last time, means that real GDP is growing, but growing at slower than 3%. So the economy is expanding too slowly. Why do we say that? Because don't forget, if the economy is not only the business part of the economy is growing, but what if the population is growing? If the population is growing, but the economy is growing too slowly, then we can have a problem that new entrants into the labor force don't get hired. So even if the economy is growing, but growing at too slow a rate, you can have the problem of increasing unemployment. So you need a certain amount of growth that's large enough to overcome the natural increase in the number of population. So that's why your author calls it a growth recession. The economy is growing, but unfortunately not enough workers are being hired considering the economy has a growing workforce. And then of course, recessions are a real reduction in GDP. And the GDP going down means the total production of goods and services is actually declining from one period to another. Normally we require it to happen for 2 or more consecutive quarters, so for roughly 6 months. So we don't take any little bobble in the economy as a sign that we're in a recession. It has to be substantial enough and long enough that we feel confident that we're going to call this a recession. So normally 2 consecutive quarters. And then last but not least, the word depression, which is simply an extremely deep recession. They are both the same thing. Real GDP is contracting, but in a recession, it contracts within the normal amount that we've seen in previous recessions. A depression is an extreme outlier or much greater level of recession. Now, instead of going back to all the way to the 1930s, let's talk about a more recent recession, the famous quote-unquote Great Recession of 2008 to 2009. The word Great Recession gets its name as a play on words, as you could imagine, from the Great Depression. The Great Recession, I think we've gone a little overboard with this naming thing. The unemployment rate, as you can see on our slide, reached 10%. But it also reached 10% back in the 1980s when President Reagan was first elected. When he first came into office, a major recession happened in the United States and unemployment actually hit 10.4%. But we don't refer to that as the Great Recession. So what gives? Well, part of the problem was the fact that during the Great Recession, even though we started recovering in 2009, because that was the trough, go back and remind yourself when we look at that stylized picture of the business cycle, all economies have to hit a bottom somewhere and then they start to recover. So wherever that bottom is for this particular recession was in June of 2009. But unlike the 1980s recession under President Reagan, where the economy came back quite strong, I mean, so strong that people were amazed how quickly the unemployment rate started coming down. So within just a year or two, unemployment fell from over 10% all the way down to 5 or 6% within a year or so. Unfortunately, during this particular great, quote-unquote, Great Recession, the unemployment rate stayed high for about 5 years. So even though the economy was recovering, it was recovering very slowly. This would be an example of that growth recession we were talking about, where the economy is not literally in a recession. It is growing, but it's growing very, very slowly and therefore not absorbing workers off the unemployment rolls to get them back to work quickly enough. So in this particular set of slides, we're going to be trying to build a model of the macroeconomy to try to understand it. And so these are some of the macro outcomes we want to think about. We've already talked about output. Output measured in the total value of goods and services, which we're calling real GDP. We also want to talk about jobs, which goes back to that whole level of employment and unemployment. Unemployment, of course, being the most salient issue because unemployment is so painful to the people it happens to. I mean, unemployment causes huge economic dislocations. So macro outcomes that lead to unemployment are very negative, and we as a society want to do something to avoid that. The issue of prices. Prices, of course, go into the calculation of inflation. When the average of all prices of goods and services is rising, we define that as inflation. And so that is crucial. We want to understand what causes inflation. Growth. This is here growth of real GDP. That's the year-to-year expansion in production capacity. So growth is a very important thing. As the economy grows in its real GDP, that means everyone has now more goods and services, which means that we're all wealthier, essentially. When you actually go through the actual dollar numbers, if you have the ability to consume more, then by definition you are richer than you used to be. So that's a good thing. I've never heard anyone saying, no, I'd rather be poorer than I am now. Most of us want to be wealthier than we are now. And then last but not least, we need to keep track of the macro outcome called international balances, which we usually refer to as the trade balance, which is the difference between exports and imports, which we did again on a previous chapter when we were defining the total GDP. Remember, one of the methods we used was called the expenditure method. The C for consumption plus I for investment plus G for government expenditures plus what we called net exports. That last variable was keeping track of the international balances between the United States and whatever countries we're doing business with. Now, within this macro model of the economy, there are things that we call macro determinants. Anything that's a determinant is something that determines the outcome of something. So it turns out that we're going to focus on three major determinants of what is the outcome. So one of the things that causes the business cycle to be what it is would be internal market forces themselves. Let's just think about what would contribute to economic growth long term. Well, let's look at our line there. We see, do you all agree that if we have population growth, that means we have more workers? If you have more workers, workers can do more things, and therefore the total amount of goods and services produced should rise. So rising populations naturally lead to economic growth. Spending behavior. If people refuse to spend, then businesses can't sell what they're producing and therefore start laying off workers. So consumer spending behavior has a huge impact on the total level of economic production, economic growth, unemployment rates. All those things are determined by consumer spending. And then, of course, inventions and innovation. All new technologies that are highly productive, and I'll just give you an example. When I was very much younger, when I was first in college, I used a manual typewriter in order to type my papers because there was no computers back in the 70s, at least not for ordinary people. However, by the 1980s, with Steve Jobs inventing the Apple computer, all of a sudden computers now start becoming available to ordinary people. And very, very quickly, word processing replaces computers, replaces typewriters. That was a major boost to economic growth because I think you all recognize that computers are far more productive at cranking out words than are manual typewriters. And so there's a huge advance for our society that the computer was invented. And then, of course, it led to cell phones and all the other different kinds of very important modern electronic devices have made our society significantly more productive than it was before. So that would be an example of increasing economic growth due to an invention or an innovation. Now, those are all internal market forces contributing to the economy. There's also external shocks. Shocks are usually negative. So things like wars. Famously, back in the 1970s, the famous OPEC oil embargo took place because there was a war in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine, and the United States backed Israel. The Arab oil exporters were backing the Palestinians. They cut off our oil supply out of anger at what we were doing in that particular war. Just like the United States put sanctions against Russia for what they did in Ukraine, well, the Arab countries were doing the same thing to us. Bottom line, highly disruptive because if they cut off oil supply, do we have a shortage of oil? Yes. And what do shortages do to prices? They skyrocketed prices, and that triggered a very big recession in the early 1970s. So the point here in this particular section is external shocks not caused by the market forces themselves, can also have major impacts on the economy. The 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center caused a huge recession in the United States. Other kinds of things like that can cause major economic disruptions. And then last but not least, what are called policy levers. Here the idea is to think of government officials as like, operating heavy machinery and grabbing levers to either make the machine go forward or go backward. That's the metaphor. So a policy lever is, what can a government official do to change how the economy is functioning? Obviously, tax policy has a major impact on the performance of the economy. Government spending, which we've already discussed. If government is spending significantly more money on highways, it puts people to work, that kind of thing. Changes in the availability of money, regulation, all of these different things governments can do to either speed up an economy or slow an economy down. So all three of these things, the natural internal market forces themselves, contribute to how an economy functions. External shocks like wars that happen in foreign countries that affect us, affect our economy. And then last but not least, what our government officials do through deliberate policy or mistakes of policy can affect the economy either for good or for bad. So what's the crucial controversy? Again, this is going to be a little bit of a rehash of something we talked about before, but it's very important to recognize because it sets up pretty much the entire discussion of the rest of our semester for this particular issue. So what's our problem? Are market economies naturally inherently stable or naturally inherently unstable? According to the classical economists, the traditional view before the 1930s, the economy was stable. Even if you came into a recession for some reason, like a trade war or a war over oil in the Middle East, whatever the reason, if it destabilized the economy would readjust as prices changed in order to get people to change their behavior. The economy would naturally rebalance itself and start growing again. The Keynesian view, named after John Maynard Keynes, was that no, the economy is inherently unstable. Even if it was growing fine at one point, it could literally go off the rails and the economy fall into a recession through no good reason at all. And instead of recovering, it wouldn't recover. So going back to that OPEC oil embargo, Keynes would claim, oh, so the Arabs have cut off our oil supply, causing a spike in oil prices. That's going to cause a recession. He claims the recession will not end on its own. There's no mechanism within capitalist systems to rebalance. Therefore, the government must step in and do something. So classical economists and Keynesian economists disagree quite strongly about should the government intervene in the economy when some foreign or even domestic reason causes the economy to go into a decline. Should we simply ignore it and treat it like a cold and let it recover on its own? Or do we do heavy-duty intervention in order to get the economy back on its feet? So as long as you recognize that as we go through the rest of these our chapters, all the way through the rest of the semester, this will constantly be in the background, this debate between the Keynesians who want to intervene and the classical economists who don't want to intervene. Now, part of understanding how the economy functions, we need to start talking about something called aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Luckily, we have a general idea of what these terms mean because we've already done supply and demand for individual micro markets. Now we're talking about the supply and demand at the macro level. In other words, we're going to be talking about when we say aggregate demand, we talk about the demand for all the goods and services in the system, and then aggregate supply would be the same thing on the supply side. So we're not going to focus on one particular market. We're going to be focusing on all markets simultaneously and trying to understand why the economy is doing what it's doing. So let's take a look at aggregate demand first. Aggregate demand is the total quantity of output measured as real GDP demanded at alternative price levels in a given time period. Okay, so instead of looking at the price of an individual item, we're going to be looking at the average of all prices, which we call the price level, which we're measuring with the price index. If you all remember, the CPI was the favorite price index for consumer goods. There's other price indexes, the producer price index, the GDP deflator. There's other ones as well, but most of the time we use the CPI because it's so well known. So we're going to take a look at the collective behavior of all the buyers in the marketplace. So it comprises, since it's the entire GDP, it comprises all goods and services. The aggregate demand curve slopes downward. Thank goodness, because that looks just like a normal demand curve. And this should make sense to everybody. People want to buy more goods and services at lower price levels and vice versa. This means not a lower price for the individual item, but if all items are cheaper, whatever money you have in your bank account, are you now able to buy more stuff than you used to be? Well, of course you can, right? And so would it not be logical that if all prices were lower, but you had money in the bank, you would now be a wealthier person and you would like to buy more stuff? That's all we're saying. So the aggregate demand curve is a very logical concept. So just apply, just use an example in your head like I'm doing, so you can remember, why does the aggregate demand curve slope downward?